Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Genevieve, and I'm thrilled that you're here joining us for this webinar. Whether you're a parent, educator, or professional, my goal today is to give you a fresh and practical way to support children with autism in a way that builds their confidence and independence. Let me tell you a little bit about my background before we get started for those of you who don't know me. I started as a special needs teacher in one of the special schools in Singapore. I taught there for about 7 years before moving to work as a psychologist at one of our local hospitals where we did assessment and diagnosis. And in the later years, we did intervention. It was the process of intervention that led me to RDI. It's a strategy that we use, and we have found it to be very impactful and has made a huge difference in the individuals and in the kids that we've worked with, some of whom are now young adults. Um, so I've been doing RDI for the past 20 years, and I'm currently an RDI trainer and supervisor for a lot of the consultants in training as well. Okay. All right. So let's get on with this. So today, this is the agenda that we'll be covering. We'll look at autism and the experience beyond what the label is. We'll give some strategies of how to move kids from being stuck in static thinking, and we'll look at how strategies like co-regulation, guided participation can transform the way our kids learn and grow. And we'll also look at some of the common mistakes we make and how we're going to shift our approach along with some practical strategies. We'll also do a Q&A right at the end, and then you can put your questions, any questions that you have along the way, put it into the Q&A section, and then let us know what your questions are. My colleague Hong Yin will collate all the questions, and then she'll let me know what they are at the end of the session. Oh, and this session is also being recorded. So if, let's say, if any of you have to rush off and all that, not to worry. We will have the recording out by next week on Monday morning on our YouTube channel. Okay, so let's start by reframing how we think about autism. A lot of times when we think about autism, we look at the behavior. We look at the child lining things up. We look at kids avoiding eye contact. We look at repetitive behavior. But one of the things I would like us to rethink is to think about how the behavior is actually communication about what the underlying processes are. What is happening beyond the behavior? So when I was working in the hospital, some 20 plus years ago, when we give our diagnosis, we would use this iceberg model. All right. And we'll use it to explain, like, oh, okay, the behaviors that you see, like the lining up of toys, the stimming, the repetitive speech, the lack of eye contact, all this has to do with what we used to call the triad of impairments. So the triad of impairments we used to refer to the social communication, social interaction, and social imagination. So what that means is that social communication is how a child communicates in a social setting. Okay, whether it's to say hi to someone, whether it's to interact with their parents or their peers, we're looking at the social aspect of communication. And in terms of social interaction, what we're looking at is do the kids interact with other people? How is their interaction? So some of the kids, their interaction tends to be, even for kids that interact, sometimes their interaction tends to be very directive. It's my way. I want it done this way. So these are some of the things that we look at in terms of interaction. The other thing that we look at is in terms of imagination. So when we think about imagination, we look at, is the child rigid? Is the child fixated on certain things? Are they able to, imagine, do pretend play and imagine. So these are the things that we think about when we look at the triad of impairments. And of course, we will usually talk to parents about other co-occurring issues like sensory issues, sleep issues, and anxiety. Okay, so these are just some things that we used to talk about when we look at diagnosis. What I would like us to do today is I'd like us to rethink this iceberg model. Okay, so instead of just looking at the behaviors and thinking of them in terms of the triad of impairments, this is how I would like us to look at it. I would like us to look at it in terms of the behavior. All right, meaning let's look at all behaviors, whether it's can the child make friends? Whether does the child say, hello, akong, hello, ama, everything, all that as behavior. And we consider what is the underlying processes that then we need to look at in terms of considering these behaviors. So whether they're struggling with social communication, whether they're struggling with social interaction or their imagination, what is the underlying processes that is sustaining this behavior? And what are the underlying processes that we need to work on to move them beyond these behaviors? So let's think about what is involved. So especially in Asia, a lot of parents always ask their kids, oh, okay, make sure you greet your grandparents, when you go and visit them for whatever occasion it may be. So you must go and call. All right. So, and that's the expectation that they must call. But what is required in that action of even just calling? First of all, they need the motivation to see and the purpose to see why. Why is that important? So that's one of the mental processes that they need to think. They need to think about, why does this make sense? Why is this important? For us, it's a social motivation, but for them, it's like, what's the point? I know who this person is. Why do I need to call them? So they need to have that motivation, that understanding of the why. They also need to understand, when they understand the whys, they need to realize that, well, it'll make the other person happy. It's a social thing that, yeah, may not make much sense beyond the social aspect, but it makes the other person happy. It makes the other person feel acknowledged and recognized. So that is the why behind it. And they also need to work on social referencing. Okay, we don't use the term eye contact because eye contact in and of itself is limiting. Eye contact refers to just looking at the person. But social referencing, the child needs to understand there's a social reason for why we reference a person. We reference a person because we're interested in that person's reaction. We reference a person because we want to share our joy, our emotions with that person. We reference that person because maybe we want to see that person's reaction. So, for example, the same situation of greeting an adult, the grandma or grandpa. We reference the grandma or grandpa to see whether, how they would react if we greet them. We reference our parents to see what their reaction is. Usually parents, of course, will be very happy when kids can call, hello, akong, hello, ama, right? So these are the motivations for referencing. So they have to reference and they have to realize that it has an impact. Their action of calling has an impact on the other person, which then involves hypothesizing. They need to hypothesize what that other person might be thinking and feeling in reaction to their actions. So there are a lot of underlying processes that's required for just this one behavior. So some parents will ask me, wow, you're talking about hypothesizing, you're talking about considering other people's thoughts and feelings. That's really difficult. And yeah, it's not easy, but it's not impossible to achieve. Even social referencing, it's not impossible to achieve for them to not just make eye contact, but to understand why they're referencing, to reference with purpose. In fact, for a lot of our kids, regardless of their developmental level, social referencing is one of the easiest things that we work on. for our kids to achieve. So it's not an impossible goal. However, we have to set up the situations such that our kids can work towards these goals. So one of the things I want us to think about is not just behavior management, behavior modification, but to understand the behavior and what is communicating in terms of what are the underlying processes that we actually need to work on. So, what is the issue when it comes to static thinking? When we ask our kids, oh, do this, do that, or when this happens, you must do this. So the issue with that is that real life is not static. Real life is very dynamic. There are always things changing and adjusting along the way. And our kids cannot rely on static thinking. So, for example, when our kids go to school, they're taught a lot of surface levels, what I consider surface level skills. And the thing is, not every situation is going to be the same. So, if they're taught, for example, to go to the canteen and say, uh, hello, uncle, I would like to buy chicken rice. Okay. So they buy the chicken rice, no problem. But what if the next day the uncle is no longer around? Maybe he's sick, or maybe he got into an accident and he's not going to be around for a while. Then what's going to happen? Because this child is so used to saying, hello, uncle, I want to buy chicken rice. Is he going to be flexible enough? Can he deal with the challenge of finding some alternative to eat? So these are the important aspects of why it's important to teach things that are dynamic and not static. Yeah. One of the parents recently, she was sharing with me, she said, um, you know, I noticed, right, that my son recently, even when I'm not doing specific activities with him, he's actually referencing, he's paying attention more, and he's referencing outside of our sessions. I said, yeah, because when you change the processes, you cannot turn off your brain and say, oh, okay, social referencing is only when I'm doing certain things with mom, and I'm going to switch my brain off when it comes to other things. Once these connections in the brain are built up, once these connections are strong, then it starts to become internalized. And when it's internalized, you don't have to worry about generalization. The child will be able to do it wherever they go. So that's what I want us to think about, how we're going to move from teaching things that are static to helping the child be more dynamic. Okay. So what is the alternative that we're looking at? So the alternative is to help the child to build flexibility, to develop this flexibility through a processes, what we call co-regulation and guided participation. So co-regulation is when we guide the child and we work together with the child. And later on, I'll show you a video of what co-regulation looks like. Guided participation is when we, as the adult who has had more experience in life, guides the child. That is the process that's going to help our kids grow, when we guide them and when we give the right level of challenge. That's what will build their confidence. That's what will help them with emotional regulation and also problem solving. Now, before we go on to the strategies, I want to talk about some of the common mistakes we make that keep our kids stuck. The first is we tend to overcompensate. And I think as adults, as parents, as professionals, as teachers, a lot of us tend to do that. We tend to overcompensate for the child instead of scaffolding for their independence. So what's the difference? Overcompensation is when we do too much, when it's not necessary. So we take a basic example of putting on shoes, okay? A lot of times, to be fast, to be quick, especially in the mornings when we're trying to get them out to school, we tend to do things for them. Whereas if we scaffold, So, for example, if a child is able to put their foot into the shoe, we don't put their foot into the shoe for them. We let them put their foot in the shoe. And if they're struggling with pulling up the bag, then maybe that's the part that we help them with. But then we might also need to think, okay, why are they struggling so much with pulling up the back of their shoe? Okay, is the shoe too hard? Because some of the shoes, they tend to be very hard. Or is it that the shoe is too tight? So then these are considerations that we need to make and adjust to consider so that they are able to do it on their own. Now, when we look at the social aspect, a lot of times we overcompensate socially by telling our kids what to do, what to say, how to respond. So they don't get a chance to think for themselves and to take what I consider their responsibility within the co-regulation. So when we are a part of the co-regulation, we don't want to be the ones that's always calling the child, hey, come here, come here. Hey, do this, do this. Because then it's us doing all the work and our kids are not doing the work. So we want our kids to take on that responsibility to co-regulate with us. Okay. And we'll talk about how we can do that. The other thing is sometimes there's an over reliance on routines. The world changes, their environment changes. There's always going to be change. That's the one constant, change. So routines are important. A lot of us need routines. We need structure, but we also need to build flexibility within those routines. We cannot have rigid structures that doesn't allow them for change. So we always need to build moments of change, moments of adaptability within routines. Okay, change small little things. And again, later on, I'll show you a clip where we'll talk about how we add certain variations. The next thing is when we focus on compliance rather than competence. So compliance for a lot of adults is a lot easier. It makes life for us easier if the child will just do whatever we tell them to do. That's just a fact of life. It just makes things easier. But the question we want to ask ourselves is, do we want a child that is compliant, or do we want a child that's mindful and competent? So I think one of the things we might want to rethink is consider how we facilitate that building of competence, where a child can think on their own, think critically on their own, to understand certain things and make decisions rather than to just be compliant. So I've seen some kids that are so compliant that they cannot even make basic decisions, like if they are coloring a picture, they can't even decide what color would they like to color. There's no right or wrong. If you want to color a balloon purple, green, red, it doesn't matter. It's up to you. It's up to your preference. But some of the kids, they're so used to complying that they cannot even make these decisions. I know of one boy um, who is a very bright boy, and he's in polytechnic and everything, and he's such a bright, intelligent boy, but he doesn't have the confidence to make a decision to say that, oh, I don't want to eat here today. I actually prefer to eat this instead. And he'll just go along with whatever other people want to eat. So we don't want that. We want a child who is willing, who is able to make decisions, who's able to negotiate, who is able to share their thoughts and their perspective. So that's why we don't want just compliance. We want competence. Okay, so one of the first practical strategies we'll look at is we'll look at slowing down. Now, in this first clip, what you'll see is that I'm moving very fast and I'm very focused on the activity. All right. So I'm moving from one shirt to the other and I'm not slowing down. And there's no space, no moments for thinking, for engagement, because I'm focused on the task and getting it done. I think this happens to a lot of us where we don't slow down enough, and very often we are just rushing through it. All right. So let's look at the second clip. Now, in this clip, you will see I've created moments where I'm pausing. I'm facilitating an interaction. All right. I'm also, remember how we talked about adding changes, adding variations? This is how we add changes and variations, where we're not just focused on the task, but we add elements of unpredictability, where instead of just passing her the t-shirt to fold again, I'm giving her an option to choose, to make decisions. So in this small little activity where we're folding clothes, it can be done in a completely different way where we introduce what we talked about, where we're not overcompensating, but we're scaffolding, where we're creating unpredictability. So our kids don't get stuck in static thinking, but they are able to engage in a more dynamic thinking by engaging with us, by thinking and making decisions. Okay. Of course, this is a very basic way of making decisions, but it's a start for a lot of our kids. So you'll notice this part, I added another change, another variation. I've already scaffold by showing her how I would fold the t-shirt. All right. So by pausing and waiting, she now realizes that, oh, it's her responsibility. So this is how we shift the responsibility to the child. It's her responsibility to take on the role of doing that part, which she didn't do before. And you notice the referencing that sorry, and you notice the referencing, right? She referenced to check my reaction. So this is meaningful referencing where she was checking to see whether, okay, is she on the right track? You know, what is her reaction to what I just did? So again, you see that checking towards the end as well, right? Where she's checking because she's finished to see my reaction. Okay. So this is how we can build in all these moments where we allow a child to think. We add more little bits of unpredictability that's manageable for the child. We don't want to have huge changes. Okay. We need to pitch it at the right level for the child. So when we're adding these changes, these variations, these small little challenges, it always has to be pitched at the level that's just right for the child. So how do we know what's the just right level for the child? We have to try. Okay, we have to get to know our kids better. We have to try to see where we can pitch it so that it's at the right level for the child, where we're adding little moments of challenge, where they're getting opportunities to think and be flexible, and then they start to build the confidence and the competence because they can overcome these little moments of challenges. That is what builds competence. Okay. So slowing down allows us to do that. By slowing down, we give our kids more time to think. We give our kids more time to process, to make decisions. Because when we ask our kids to do something, so, one of the things I always talk about is communication. A lot of times when we communicate things to our kids, we always tell them, okay, can you go and pack your toys? And then nothing gets done. And then we repeat that question, can you pack your toys? And each time we get angrier, and the time between our statement gets shorter and shorter because we're getting more and more agitated and frustrated. Okay. So in such situations, how do we scaffold without getting ourselves upset and still allow more processing time? Because we have to remember, for many of our kids with neurodevelopmental challenges, their processing of communication is actually slower. All right. Not that they're slow, but it takes them a longer time to process information. So we actually need to allow more time. I remember one of the young men, when he used to tell me when he was a teenager, He said that, Auntie Jen, it's not that I don't want to join in conversations, but by the time I've thought about what I want to say, everybody else has gone on to another topic already. So their process, there is a lag and there is some time in terms of their processing. So we need to give them more time. So by allowing them more time, it allows them to process what we said. Go and keep your toys. Okay. And if they don't keep their toys, the next level of scaffold is not another verbal for a couple of reasons. One, another verbal instruction is usually for most kids too high a level of a scaffold because the reason why they didn't do it is not because they didn't understand. Most of our kids would have understood the instruction. The reason why they didn't do it is one, they needed more time to process that information. Two, they didn't feel like doing it. Okay, so it's not from a lack of understanding. So by repeating the verbal, it's actually an unnecessary compensation. So what we want to do is we want to scaffold appropriately. And to scaffold appropriately, we move closer. All right. By moving closer, we make our presence more prominent. And by making our presence more prominent, it sort of like shows them that, hey, I'm here, I'm waiting, And for some kids, that's enough. And they will get on with packing the toys. For some kids, that level of scaffold is still not enough. Whether it's because, like I said, they may still be processing or they may not want to do it. Then the next level of scaffold, after we gradually move closer, the next level of scaffold would involve taking a toy, passing it to them. Now, for majority of the kids, and I've done this in sessions with many of the kids who are having fun and they don't want to keep, we just pass it to them. And I'll say, oh, help Auntie Jen. And then the minute you pass it to them and you show them to put it in whatever the container is, inevitably, by the time you pass them the next one, they'll be keeping it. Okay. And that is how we establish a co-regulation where we are working together for the goal of keeping toys in this instance. So this is what we do, in terms of a co-regulation and how we guide our kids without overcompensating. So the next thing we talk about, which I mentioned a little bit about communication, is we want to use experience sharing communication. So what is the difference between experience sharing and static communication? Static communication usually refers to things like your questions, your statements. So like keep your toys. That is static communication. What do you do today? That is static communication. Um, the the mountains are very tall. That is static communication. Okay, so all that is static. It's a fact, is known. Experience sharing is different. Experience sharing helps with connection, and that's what we want. We want our kids to be able to connect with other people. So when we share our thoughts and feelings, that is experience sharing communication. The thing I get asked with a lot of parents is that, well, my kids are not interested in experience sharing communication. If I were to say something that's not related to what they're interested in, they'll walk off. And I would say that, yes, that's the initial response. A lot of times when we first start experience sharing communication, because our kids don't know what to make of it, suddenly mommy is saying, wow, today I had chicken rice from this chicken rice store. It was probably one of the best chicken rice I've ever had. One of these days, I would really want to bring you there to enjoy it. They are wondering what is she going on about because they're not used to experience sharing communication. Because what happens is a lot of times when our kids, when they face challenges with language and communication, as adults, our communication becomes skewed as well. So rather than using the experience sharing communication that we use with other people, like our friends, we start to adopt a very abnormal style of communication with our kids. And when we adopt an unusual style of communication with our kids, guess what? That's the communication that they're going to pick up as well. So we have to shift to a more typical type of communication, which is experience sharing. And experience sharing communication actually makes up about 80% of our human day-to-day communication. Because think about it, when you are communicating with your friends, do you instruct them what to do? Do you give them facts and information? We don't, because that's a very unusual way of communicating. Instead, we share with them what we're thinking, what we're feeling. So that's what we want to start with our kids as well. And initially, like I'll share with a lot of parents, initially it feels like you're talking to the wall, like you're not getting any response. But when we start to do this on a regular basis, in time to come, our kids will start to process that information. Remember, they need time for processing, right? So in time, they'll start to process that information, and then they'll start to appreciate and understand and even use experience sharing communication in time to come. So how do we go about doing this? Some parents do it at dinner time. Okay, I had one family, mom and dad came up with this, well, we'll take turns sharing about our day. So I thought, hey, that's good. It's a good way, even for all families to connect, to share about your day, and they went with highs and lows, but you can share in any way you want. But what they decided was, we'll share one high of the day and one low of the day. So that's how they went about being more mindful about using experience sharing language. In addition to experience sharing language, the other thing we need to consider is also nonverbal communication, and nonverbal communication that's experience sharing. So what do I mean by that? Nonverbal communication is your facial expression, your body language, the intonations that you use, the emphasis that you place on certain words and certain things that you're saying, the pauses that you use, the slowing down in certain places, right? All this has meaning. Where you pause, where you slow down, how you place emphasis on certain things, as you raise your volume about certain things, they all communicate. And again, nonverbal communication, which is something a lot of us tend not to look at, is a large part of day-to-day communication. About 70% of our communication is nonverbal. So if we only focus on static verbal communication, think about how much we are actually limiting our child's communication. So we don't want to limit their communication to only static verbal communication. We want to widen their bandwidth of communication. We want them to be able to engage in non-verbal experience sharing communication. Because if they don't, then our kids risk taking a lot of what is said very literally. So an example that I like to give is, when someone tells you, oh, you're so clever, versus someone saying, oh, you're so clever. You're saying the same thing. The words are exactly the same, but the intonation, the emphasis change. And with that change in intonation and emphasis, the meaning completely changes. We know that in the second one, the person is being sarcastic and they don't really mean what they say. But our kids don't. Our kids are very happy and say, yeah, he's my friend. He says I'm very clever. And we don't want that, because a lot of misunderstandings are going to arise because of that. So we want our kids to have that rich bandwidth of communication. Don't limit our kids to just static verbal communication. The next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at setting up manageable challenges. So this is what we talked about a little earlier, about how we're going to set up challenges that are manageable, that is not overwhelming. Okay, so we have to understand what is just right for the child. So in RDI, what we talk about is we talk about the H+1. Okay, so what that means is that, we need to know is what is the child's current level of ability. Okay, and then we add that +1, that little bit of challenge. Okay, we don't want it to be a +10, because that's overwhelming and you're going to have a child that feels overwhelmed and incompetent. Okay, We also don't want it to be too easy, because if it's too easy, then there was no challenge and the child didn't grow from it. So we build resilience. Just think about the times where we built our own resilience, we built our own confidence. It's not during times where everything was smooth sailing. It's during time when we faced the challenge and we overcame that challenge. That is the time where we felt, wow, this was really hard, but I actually managed it. So that is how we build resilience, by overcoming authentic challenges. Okay. So how do we set up manageable challenge? First, we need to know what level the child is at and then add accordingly. So I have this one girl. She's currently working on this challenge. Okay. And so what we did was, I remember we worked on it last Saturday, and I gave her a lot of books to pack into a bag. And I told her, oh, can you help Auntie Jen pack all this into the bag? I want to bring all these books home. So she was very nice. She started packing. And of course, I deliberately made sure that the books were too many and some were too big to fit into that bag. So then she packed, and then she said, oh, it's too full. Auntie Jen cannot pack anymore. Then she said, oh, I need another bag. So I said, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. But you see, she came up with that idea so fast, I knew it wasn't a challenge, because it was almost immediate where she said, Auntie Jen, I need another bag. So I said, okay, here you go. Here's another bag. So I gave her a second bag, also knowing full well that not all the books were going to fit into that bag. So she started packing again, and then she realized, oh yeah, not the books are not going to fit. Okay. So then she gave it some thought. So this time I could tell, there's a bit of a challenge, because she paused and she thought about it. That's how we know where the challenge is just right. She wasn't overwhelmed by it. She was engaged in the challenge and she was thinking about it. So she thought about it and she decided, you know what? I think I can shove a few more books. So fine, she started shoving a few more books. But of course, still, no matter how much she shoved, not all the books were going to fit. And there was this big book that there was no way it was going to fit into either bag. So then she asked me, Auntie Jen, can I have another bag? So I said, oh, you know what? I only have these two bags. I don't have another bag. How? So then she thought about it, and this time I knew it was a much bigger challenge for it, because the thinking time was longer, but it was still manageable for her, because she was still engaged in the thinking process and she was not overwhelmed by it. So this time she thought for longer, and then she said, Auntie Jen, keep back on the shelf. Oh, so then at that point I accepted it, because I knew that she thought for quite a long time, and that was probably her threshold. If I had pushed for more, it would probably have been too overwhelming for her. So then I accepted that suggestion. I said, oh, okay, all right, that's a good idea. I'll keep this book. Maybe the next time then I'll bring it back. So that's how we find challenges. And each child's challenge is different. Like for hers, it required some thinking. For another child, he would whine at the smallest of change. And when I say the smallest of change, I really mean the smallest of change. Even something as simple as his mother passing him something in different directions was enough to make him whine. He just wanted something just pass in the same way. So mom will pass him something and he'll go and keep. Right. So for him, the level of challenge, to make it manageable for him, it had to be really small. So the challenge for him was just to take things when mom passed it maybe higher up, or when mom passed it lower down. And for him, a really big challenge in the beginning was when mom held the object high up, such that he needed to stand up from his chair to reach. Now, to us, we are thinking, what's the big deal? Just stand up from the chair and you can reach it. But for him, it took a lot of courage in order to move past his comfort zone to be able to do that. And what we saw was the first time he started fussing, whining a lot, and he was very reluctant. But mom waited. She held it there and waited because she realized that, yeah, it was still manageable for him, because although he was whining and fussing a bit, it was not to the point where he was about to have a meltdown. So she waited, and eventually he pushed himself, and he stood up, and he took the object from mom. Okay. And he felt good about it. And subsequent times where, mom started handing him stuff and all that, now it's not a big deal to him anymore because he overcame that challenge. And mom commented that nowadays, a lot of times she hardly hears the whining even in day to day, because his resilience has grown through all these little challenges. It's not the one challenge alone, but it's through the introduction or an opportunity to work on many, many such challenges that shows him that, hey, I did it. It's many such moments of, wow, I can do it, that builds his resilience. And you'll start to see it translating in his day-to-day life with other things as well. So that's the beauty about working with processes and not just the focus on specific behaviors. Okay. Now, the next thing is we need to model flexibility in everyday situation. All right. So one of the ways that we can do this is sometimes talk about how we handle changes. When things come our way and things get thrown our way that are unexpected, we can just tell ourselves like, oh no, uh that's it. Or we can be flexible and think about what else we can do. So one of the things that I can share about my journey to RDI is that when I was working in the hospital, one of the programs that we had set up was we set up interventions, and there were so many of us working with these kids, in the interventions that we set up. We did your social stories, we did structured teaching, we even had school readiness, where we taught our kids how to pack bag, how to organize their things so that they'll be ready to go into the mainstream school. We did visual strategy, so many things. um, and we also had other professionals, occupational therapists, speech therapists. We worked together as a team to help these kids prepare. And one year we were given special permission to go into the schools to see, well, how well did all the things that we did transition, help them transition to school. And without exception, none of the kids transitioned well. They all struggled. And that has to do with what we taught them static skills. What they needed dynamic, flexible thinking to able to cope in dynamic environments. So one of the personal things that I did in terms of showing flexibility is I could have decided then that, well, that's the best we could do for our kids. Or I could do what I did, which was to learn, to find out. And that's how I stumbled across RDI. And I took personal leave to go and listen to Dr. Gutstein speak. And what he said made a lot of sense, because a lot of the principles that he talked about was based on neuroscience that was coming out then. Then he read a lot of research, to develop the RDI program. So that's one of the things we can model in everyday situations, how we deal with situations. Are we just going to be saying that, oh, okay, this didn't work well, but it's the best that we can do, fine? Or are we going to tell ourselves that let's try and figure out what else can we do? Let's adapt, let's create, let's be flexible. This is how we model for everyday situations. Now, you must be wondering, why is there a picture of two presents, here when we talk about flexibility? Well, this is one of the things that we talk about in terms of our kids and how we help them build flexibility. We talk about our kids being able to come up with plan A, plan B, plan C, even plan D. For many of our kids, plan A, not an issue. So remember the little girl that was packing the books in the bag? Her plan A, can I have another bag? Not an issue. Very easy. Okay. Plan B becomes harder. So on this occasion, I asked one of the boys to help me wrap some presents. And I gave him wrapping paper of differing sizes. So the first present that you see on the right here, it's perfectly wrapped up, okay? And it was a bigger piece of paper. So he could wrap it up. No problem. All right. Then came the next piece of paper. All right. Where this time the paper couldn't fit. Okay. And what he did was, this was actually his plan C. His plan B was a paper that didn't fit, but when he turned the object around, he managed to get it to fit. So that was his plan B. So this, what you see here, where you can, if you look closely, you can see there are bits of papers being joined together. This was his plan C. So using uh, two pieces of paper that didn't fit, what he did was he wrapped one, and then the second piece, he tore it up into small pieces to cover up all the exposed areas. So that's flexibility, creating opportunities for our kids to come up with that plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. Of course, not everything has to be done in one session, because sometimes it's also not practical to have plan C and plan D in one session. So, what I always tell parents is like, you can continue plan C and plan D another day. So for example, if you are wrapping presents and you use tape to wrap the present, what if the second day you ran out of tape? Mommy, for whatever reason, used up all the tape and there's no more tape in the house. So maybe the boy suggests, oh, okay, plan B, let's go to the shop and buy tape. All right. So then you might say, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Oh, but you know what? We need to get the present, give the present uh, when they come over to the house and they're coming in like the next 10-15 minutes. I don't think we have time to go to the shop to buy tape. So then what are we going to do? So it's not that his idea was bad. It was a good idea, but it wasn't workable in that situation. So then he has to come up with plan C. What else can we do if we can't use tape? You know, how creative is he going to be? So that's how we push for that flexibility in thinking. And we can do this in complex situations like wrapping things or in simpler things, like putting things in a bowl, where, oh, okay, the bowl is not big enough for us to put all the food in it. What are we going to do? So it's about us and how creative we are to help out create opportunities for our kids to build on these on their flexibility in their thinking. Now, the next thing we need to focus on is, before we can do all this problem solving, all this flexible thinking and all that, we need to focus on emotional regulation first. Because if our kids are not emotionally regulated, they will not be able to think. So, uh, a lot of our kids, I always tell, especially the older ones, I always tell them, did you regulate? Because they understand, did you regulate? Because if you didn't regulate, you're not going to think clearly. And very often, when they are regulated, they can actually make good decisions. All right. It's just we have to help them regulate. And when I talk about regulation, I talk about it in terms of two ways. One, daily regulation. We have to regulate on a daily basis. Now, what this looks like, whether it involves physical activity to regulate the mind and body, to release some of that stress, because movement helps shift emotions. Whenever a child is stressed, dysregulated, when we get the child to move, it can help shift their emotions. So, for example, and this is an example I often give. There was one boy. He came to our school side, and he was feeling very dysregulated, very upset because it was an accumulation of a few things. So what I did was I sat with him first. Okay. Then after sitting with him, I told him, "Oh, I feel like I need to go for a walk." So I'm not telling him you need to go for a walk, because if you tell him you need to go for a walk, you're going to get a lot of resistance. He's going to say, no, I don't want. right? And he's going to fast. So I'm saying I need to go for a walk. And then what I did was held his hand and I waited, still sitting down with him. After a while, I stood up, still holding his hand, and I waited. And then after waiting some time, he stood up. Then we started to walk together. Now, how long the walk is depends. A lot of parents always ask, how long to walk for? It depends on how much you need to regulate. So when we talk about daily regulation, if let's say the child is very stressed, like I have one boy who's going through PSLE this year and he's quite stressed out, then he has to have more daily regulation. He has to have more daily physical activity to release some of that pent up stress. So it depends on how much stress that child is experiencing. So the first level is that daily regulation. That is more maintenance, is to make sure we have enough resources to deal with whatever challenges come our way. All right. The next part is moving to regulation. So first, we need to recognize when a child is feeling dysregulated. Dysregulated children can be dysregulated because they're anxious, because they're stressed, because they're too excited. All this can dysregulate them. So they need to know when to move to regulation. So I'll give you an example. One of the young men that I work with, he gets very dysregulated when he's looking at or talking about his favorite stars, on TV and all that. So whenever he sees pictures of them or thinks about pictures of them, that's when he gets very dysregulated. So one of the things we taught him is that he needs to learn how to shift to regulation, whether it's occupying his mind so that he's mentally not perseverating on these images, and doing mental exercises so that he doesn't do perseverate. Whatever the regulation is, he needs to recognize when he's about to get dysregulated and move himself to carry out one of the regulation strategies that he has been taught. For kids that are younger, the parents have to be the one to recognize when they are dysregulated and then to help them move that shift. So for some parents, when they notice their child starts to get a bit dysregulated, they might be handed a bottle of water because the sucking motion can be very regulating, you know. And it's quite normal to suck and drink from a straw, especially when they're younger. So a lot of times it depends, but the hardest part is figuring out what regulates our kids. And there's no one fixed thing that is going to regulate the kids. Just like for all of us, how we regulate is very different. Some of us, we might go for a run to regulate. I can tell you that that would not be for me. I would not be running to regulate. Some people like window shopping to regulate. So there are many different ways that we use to regulate, and our kids are the same. There'll be many different ways that they want to use to regulate. So what we need to do is we need to try out different things, and then we need to observe to see what was helpful, what was relaxing for them. So that's the tough part for parents, trying to figure out what can be regulating. And there's no magic activity. It takes trial and error to try out different things to see what is regulating for your child. Okay, so I know this was a lot of information to take in, and because of time constraints, we can only cover it in a short amount of time. But if you wanted to learn more, all right, go to the RDI Connect website. They also have a lot of information there. We also share a lot of information via our social media channels. So go to these areas so that you can find more information in terms of what we've talked about. Uh, for families, if you are interested in looking to work with a consultant, you can go to the RDI website and you can find certified consultants from about 31 different countries there. All right. And if you're a professional and you're interested in professional training, again, you can go to the RDI Connect website. There are trainings from pretty much every part of the world. I'm the training director for Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. So you can go there to find out, whether the training is right for you and whether this is something you want to do. Okay. And that's all I have for you today. We'll open up the floor for Q&A. We also have a QR code if you would like to give us some feedback so that we know what was helpful for you, whether you would like us to talk about other topics, whether you want us to delve into some things in more detail, feel free, let us know. Okay, so we'll open up to Q&A, and then if you have any questions, like I said, type in the chat, and then Hong Yin will get it to me so that I will know what your questions are. Okay, so I have a question about what are the charges for uh, individual help. That one is a bit hard to say because, like I said, there are many consultants around the world. So everybody will charge differently. So what I will say is that identify which consultant you feel comfortable working with. Go to their website, drop them a message, get in touch with them. Because when you talk about working with a consultant, it's a relationship. All right, because your consultant will be guiding you. So you have to feel comfortable with that person. And then ask them what their charges are and all that. So different consultants will charge differently. So I can't really say what their charges are because a lot will depend also on their background, whether, like for us, we're psychologists, but there are other consultants who are occupational therapists. There are some who are parents who have done REI, and then they decide to get certified as well. Okay, how to help a kid with both autism and ADHD. Okay, we have quite a number of kids that we work with that have a dual diagnosis of both autism and ADHD. So, a large part will be focused on regulation, but a lot of the principles in terms of working on the underlying processes will still be the same because we still want to help with the underlying processes. Um, because everybody will benefit from being able to hypothesize, being able to socially reference, being able to empathize, being able to consider the perspective of other people, so everybody will benefit from that. In fact, one of the fathers that I worked with, he's in charge of hiring people. And one of his comments was like, "Hey, Jen, I think my staff will benefit from some of these things." I said, "Yeah, probably, but your staff not within my purview, lah." So everybody will benefit from that. What's one strategy to shift myself to regulation when I get triggered by my child's behavior? That's an excellent question. One of the things we always talk about is to families is we actually talk about needing to regulate ourselves first. Because if we don't regulate ourselves, then what happens is our kids pick up on our emotions, and they get more dysregulated as well. Dr. Daniel Siegel, if you have time, read his books. He has really lovely books, and some are very um, accessible. His whole brain child, especially, very accessible read, very good read. So he talks about this hand model of the brain. Okay, so if we talk about it, look at it that way. If this is the brain, okay, and we're oriented this way, so this part is your prefrontal cortex that's responsible for all your higher order thinking and all that, and the middle part is the emotion part of the brain. Now, for a lot of us, when we lose it, he terms it as flipping our lids. So what do we need to do to bring ourselves back online? So for a lot of us, we have to, how we talk about kids having to work on emotional regulation? Very often we also have to work on our own emotional regulation. So we have to practice. Which is one of the things I say to the older kids as well. You have to practice. You're not going to be able to access strategies for emotional regulation just like that when you need it. if you have not internalized it, if you have not practiced it enough, such that it becomes second nature to you. So it takes practice, it takes work. So to give you a strategy, one of the easiest strategies that I teach a lot of the kids is what we call the 2-1 breathing. Okay. So what that means is that you breathe in, say for a count of 3 or 4, and then you breathe out for a count of 6 or 8. Basically, your out breath should double your in breath. So that's one easy regulation strategy that I help our kids to work on. And for parents also. And I know a lot of times, sometimes when I get, especially agitated by some of my daughter's teachers. I also find myself, I have to regulate, so I am there breathing so that I can make mindful decisions and take mindful actions. And yeah, so yes, it's a very good question. A lot of times we parents have to work on our own emotional regulation because it's already so hard for our kids to regulate their emotions. And if we don't work on our own, then we're sort of like piling our emotions on theirs, and they can't even handle theirs. How are they going to handle ours as well? So, very good question. We also have to work on our own emotional regulation. Now, the other aspect is sometimes if you find certain behaviors very triggering, remove yourself where possible from that situation. Not remove your child, remove yourself from that situation. As long as you know your child is safe. So, for example, if you're at home, okay, move yourself to another room, and maybe have the helper or another parent stay with the child to make sure the child is safe. So remove yourself so that you're not the one getting triggered. I know one family, uh a husband and wife. So what they do is they sometimes take turns, if mom is the one getting triggered, then that sort of steps in to watch the child while mom takes a break, and tries to work on regulating. So that's one possible way. Okay, if there are no other questions, then if you have other things that come up on another occasion, drop us a message. We're more than happy to connect with anyone if you have any questions, anything you want to ask us. Okay, so these are our contacts that you can reach us. And we have Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, where we share resources practically on a daily basis, so that as many families as possible can hopefully benefit from the resources we share. Of course, um, our sometimes our resources may not be that entertaining, like we are psychologists after all, but we do our best to try and share as much information as possible to try and benefit as many people as possible. Okay, and let me leave you with this quote by Dr. Gutstein. So that's our goal. We want to give our kids challenges so that they can really grow in terms of their confidence and their independence. All right. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Okay. All right. Thank you. Bye.